There are so many chapters in American history that present an opportunity to contextualize what happened yesterday and to get students to think deeper about all of these questions that are fundamental to American democratic practice. I submit to you, Melba Patilla Beals talking about Little Rock High from her diary, from her
I'm
book,
not
Warriors Don't
particularly
Cry.
comfortable.
Here she is. How strange, I thought, to be involved in something the whole nation considers among its 10 most important stories. If it's that important, you think somebody would do something to make the Central High students behave themselves. Is it that nobody cares or nobody knows what to do? I love that because in some sense, here's Melba Patilla Beals as a high schooler in Little Rock High in 1958, reflecting on a world of chaos. Her governor and president at odds over what to do about 9 children entering Little Rock High, a Supreme Court decision that frames their right to attend school, and then having the National Guard, the Arkansas Guard sit in one moment to keep them from going to school, and then brought back the next moment in order to ensure that they could go to school. And the cognitive dissonance that must have produced, and at the same time, the messiness of democracy in that moment for her. I won't read her diary to you, but the reason I like that is in framing it through that young voice, and in teaching by proxy, I can get young people to appreciate and maybe talk more about what this moment means without having to worry about being accused of being partisan in the way that I am asking them to think about these questions. If you make use of contrast, then I think about what we saw yesterday. I want to go to Dwight David Eisenhower's speech, September 24th, 1957, in response to Little Rock. And I want us to think about what he said. And all I'm going to do with my students is ask that we read Eisenhower's speech. Because what did Eisenhower say in that moment? And I don't need to set it up, and I don't need to talk about yesterday directly yet, but I just need Eisenhower to frame his response to Little Rock. What does he say? Proper and sensible observance of the law then demanded the respectful obedience which the nation has a right to expect from all of its people. This unfortunately has not been the case in Little Rock. Certain misguided persons, many of them imported into Little Rock by agitators, have insisted upon defying the law and have sought to bring it into disrepute. The orders of the court have thus been frustrated. I love this because if I had more time with you tonight, I would point it out. All the elements of the discourse that we heard yesterday about the protesters on the Capitol are on display just in this paragraph from 1957. It's not that history repeats itself, but it certainly echoes. And in those echoes, there are powerful moments for us to teach by proxy, but comment by proximity. Follow me. Eisenhower continues, the very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rest upon the certainty that the president and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the president's command. Unless the president did so, anarchy would result. There would be no security for any except that which one could provide for himself. The interest of the nation and the proper fulfillment of the law's requirements cannot yield to opposition in demonstrations by some few persons. Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of our courts. Then Eisenhower goes someplace very interesting. He says, the proper use of the powers of the executive branch to enforce the orders of the federal court is limited to extraordinary and compelling circumstances. And there he's talking about Little Rock. And he says, the decision of the Supreme Court concerning school integration, of course, affects the South more than it does any other section in the country. In that region, I have many friends. I've deemed it a great personal privilege to spend time in the Southland. And yet at the same time, Eisenhower is acknowledging he has to do his duty in this circumstance, in this situation. And what he goes on to say is, and unfortunately, it is not in my slide here, but he makes the case that, look, the eyes of the world are on, the eyes of the nation are on Little Rock, and the eyes of the world are on the nation. And as president, it is his duty and responsibility to enforce the law. Eisenhower, in that sense, is communicating in that moment his duty as commander-in-chief to ensure the preservation of American democracy, even though, as many of us continue to teach, Eisenhower himself was conflicted about the Supreme Court's decision. I want to be clear here in saying that in that moment, as we talk about how people of color experienced yesterday, one of Eisenhower's critics in 1958 is Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson writes the president in May of 1958 to complain about a speech in which Eisenhower gives, where Eisenhower essentially says that he's uncertain if you can change the hearts of men by law. What does Jackie Robinson say to him? And I put this next to this political cartoon of Uncle Sam talking to Eisenhower by her block, pictured as the nation's fire chief. You look out the window and the nation is inflamed over civil rights. And Eisenhower is looking at Uncle Sam and saying, tisk, tisk, somebody should do something about that. And you can almost imagine Uncle Sam saying, somebody, you're the president and the fire chief, the commander in chief, you should. But as I think about how people of color experienced yesterday and the contrast between the treatment of demonstrators during Black Lives Matter protests and yesterday, here's Jackie Robinson. My dear Mr. President, I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday when you said we must have patience. And hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, oh no, not again. I respectfully remind you, sir, that we have been the most patient of all people. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how you would have self-respect and remain patient concerning the treatment accorded us through the years. 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we're entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals which other Americans achieved 150 years ago. As the chief executive of our nation, I respectfully suggest that you unwittingly crush the spirit of freedom in African Americans by constantly urging forbearance and giving hope to those pro-segregationist leaders like Governor Falvis, who would take from us even those freedoms we now enjoy.